All right, Zach, thanks. The life story of Dangerfield Newby ranges from hopeful to horrific. Born in Virginia, he was one of 11 children. He grew up a slave, married a woman who was also a slave, and they had 7 children. He moved to Bridgeport here in the Ohio Valley because Ohio was a free state, hoping to raise the money to buy his wife and children and move them to Ohio as well. It is at this point that 7 News reporter DK Wright begins our story of the life of Dangerfield Newby.
Dangerfield Newby was desperately trying to raise almost $1,500 to buy his wife and children and bring them to freedom.
He was a blacksmith, so he worked as a blacksmith locally and in northeastern Ohio, but he was also begging for money.
He managed to raise half the money. Meanwhile, his wife Harriet wrote him increasingly urgent letters.
His wife was begging with him all during this period that her situation was becoming more dire. They're heartbreaking letters, and they're interesting because it tells us that both husband and wife were literate at a time when the vast majority of the enslaved were not.
Her last letter was the most desperate.
So she told Dangerfield that if he could not purchase her freedom, the earth would have no charms for her. And she closed the letter saying, do all you can for me, which I have no doubt you will.
So Newby joined up with John Brown, the fiery abolitionist who was planning to raid Harper's Ferry, West Virginia.
And if Brown's raid were successful, that would have put Newby only about 60 miles away from where his wife was at that time.
But Brown's raid was disastrous, with 10 of his men killed. Newby was the first to die.
By a shot which was described as a small iron spike that cut Newby's throat from ear to ear.
Even after death, his body was a target.
Some of the enraged citizens and militiamen grabbed Newby's body and dragged it into a nearby alley where they began to dismember and desecrate his corpse. His ears were cut off as souvenirs.
Days later, he was buried in a mass grave. Back in Bridgeport, Ohio, when citizens heard of Newby's part in John Brown's raid, 3 men took out their anger on Newby's brother Gabriel.
And they grabbed him and drug him out onto the streets of Bridgeport and nearly beat him to death.
Dangerfield had 4 brothers who went on to fight in the Civil War, carrying on his quest for freedom. The money he raised to free his wife and children never went to them. They were sold to other plantation owners. His siblings sued for the money and won. 40 years after his death, Newby and his fellow raiders' bodies were disinterred, taken to New York, and buried beside John Brown's body. Now, 164 years after his death, Dangerfield Newby is still remembered.
The main character in Quentin Tarantino's Django Unchained movie is loosely based off of Dangerfield Newby.
He's been the subject of art, music, TV shows, and books, and there are reportedly still some of his descendants living in the Ohio Valley. DK Wright for 7 News, working for you.
DK, thanks. Even though Dangerfield Newby only lived in the Ohio Valley for about a year, his story is remembered and embraced as an important part of history.